This is my 141st video on my work with OO gauge. See part 1 of this series for my reasons for getting into OO gauge when I already had a lot invested in working in N gauge and I didn't really have space available for a large, fully operational OO gauge layout. Also see my lengthy series on my N gauge railway modelling for smaller and more complex scenery and smaller scale trains running. This part will be a kit build video with a bit of difference. I'll be building the Dapol Kitmaster kit C026 for an 040 saddle tank locomotive, which is, I believe, based on the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway Class 21 Pug. I don't normally build dummy locomotives, that is, static models that don't run at all and are just for show. I bought this kit with a very specific end in mind. In several of my previous videos I've shown railway cranes, in which I have a particular interest. I introduced several crane models in part 123, restored an old Hornby Double-O breakdown crane in part 124, and showed my new Bachmann Ransoms and Rapier breakdown crane in part 132. I would have liked to have shown those cranes lifting a locomotive, as they would often have been required to do so. And I tried, but even the lightest working model loco that I had was too heavy for the cranes to manage. The weight of my lightest loco model was simply heavier than the model cranes could lift without falling over and or unravelling. I demonstrated the cranes using lighter loads, containers, stripped down wagons, but I kept in mind the idea of lifting a loco with a breakdown crane, and I thought that the likeliest path to that would be by building a loco from a plastic kit. I then ran into something of a problem, as my prototype for my OO gauge layouts is LMS operations in the 1920s and 1930s, and pretty much all of the plastic kits of locos that are available are either for post-war locos or for Southern or GWR locos. The only kit that I could find that could be made to fit into my pre-war LMS prototype was this one, which is listed as an 040 TBR Pug, but appears to be based upon the L&YR Class 21, which was a class operated by the LMS, and I do have a working model of this class, Hornby R2065, which I showed in part 115, and it's shown up a couple of times since. So, long introduction, but anyway, I'll be building this kit as a loco working for the LMS, not BR, and I'm building it for the specific purpose of using it as a load for my larger railway cranes, so we'll see it in that capacity at the end of this video. Here's the kit as it came, in the current standard Dapol kit packaging of a plastic bag stapled to a card. The instructions were printed on one side of an included folded sheet. None of the parts came on sprues, most of the parts were loose in the main bag, and there was a second smaller Ziploc bag containing the smallest parts, and also a small sheet of basic decals for the BR version. Here's more of a close-up of the parts. Some of the parts were in pretty awful shape, with lots of flash and casting artifacts, but we can't really blame Dapol for this, as these kits are being produced from very old moulds which have inevitably deteriorated. Here's the top of the instructions. There are some clues here that not all is as it should be. For example, we are advised to paint all parts as in Section 4, but the instructions didn't contain a Section 4, or indeed anything else about painting the parts. Here's the first of the exploded diagrams in the instructions, this one covering the assembly of the chassis. Only half of the parts in the diagram are numbered. The first instruction is to cement pins 1 and 1A, but nothing on the diagram is actually labelled 1 or 1A. Here's one of the Loco Wheels illustrating how they came. I spent about an hour just trying to get the parts back roughly to the shape they were supposed to be, as far as I could determine that, which was sometimes difficult. I did my best with knife, clippers, file and emery board to remove flash and casting artifacts and smooth the parts to shape. You can see the decals here at top centre, just 2 BR crests and 2 running numbers. Back to the chassis diagram. It does at least seem to show all of the chassis parts, although it isn't entirely clear how some of them are supposed to go together, or at least it wasn't clear to me from this diagram. The intent of the first instruction was apparently that the 2 main halves of the chassis should be glued together by their connecting pins. At this point I took the small parts out of their separate bag. I was almost tempted to give up on the kit at this point, as I really didn't fancy trying to clean up these parts, many of which are so tiny that holding them at all is difficult. However, I did persist. I tried the fit of the wheels and the axles without gluing them, to make sure that they would actually go together before trying to fit them to the chassis. With a little more sanding, they went together quite well. So now I actually passed the axles through the sides of the chassis and glued them together. Next to be worked on were the cylinders and crossheads. The crossheads are fitted onto their rails with the piston rods fitting into the cylinder with no glue used. Then the main driving rods are glued to the pins on the back of the crossheads, but I must admit that I had trouble figuring out which cylinder went on which side of the Loco which way up the first time I glued these, and I got the rods on upside down with the oiling points, the little blips on the far ends, on the bottom rather than on the top. So when I realized that, I had to take the rods off and glue them on again the right way round. The connecting rods are fixed to the front wheels by passing a crank pin through the recessed end and then gluing the end of the crank pin into the wheel. Here are both connecting rods connected to the front wheels. Next, the cylinders are glued in place, with the main part of the cylinder itself fitting over the part on the chassis, and the supporting pin at the other end of the crosshead rails fitting into a hole in the chassis. It was when I went to do this that I realized that I had the driving rods on the wrong way up and redid them. Now both cylinders are in place. The instructions for assembling the chassis simply end at this point. And it was at this point that I started to get really annoyed with Dapol. They can't be blamed for the terrible condition of the parts, given the age of the moulds, but it seems that whoever put together these instructions just couldn't be arsed, as the Scots say. This level of sloppiness and incompetence seems to me to indicate that Dapol hold their customers in utter contempt. I can see that a tired employee might put together instructions missing important directions and whole sections, but doesn't someone else check these things before they're mass-produced and sent out for sale? Anyway, left to figure out things for myself, it appeared that the ends of the driving rods and the connecting rods needed to be connected together and to be connected to the back wheels. Having used all of the short, small-headed pins in the detail bag, I only had 2 small-headed pins left which were longer, and I presume these were intended to make this connection. So I passed those long pins through the ends of the rods and glued the ends of the pins into the holes in the back wheels. This gave me wheels and a driving motion that worked okay. The other piece of assembly not mentioned in the instructions was attaching the running board to the top of the chassis, but the instructions seemed to assume that the running board was in place on the chassis after this, so I tried to figure out how it should go on. It appeared that the sides of the chassis were intended to fit over the lugs at either end of the running board, as seen here, with the ends of the chassis just lining up with the ends of the running board. I attached the running board to the chassis in that way. It didn't seem very keen to stay in place, perhaps due to warping, so I clamped it until the gluing set. Next, the 2 halves of the boiler needed to go together. There were locating pins on one half that fitted into holes in the other half. However, if I fitted the 2 halves together using the locating pins, the dome, chimney, etc., didn't line up properly at all, as seen here. So to get the two halves fitted together properly, I had to remove the locating pins to allow me to slide the parts into proper alignment. With the pins removed, I was able to fit the parts together more or less lined up. I clamped the chimney as it didn't want to stay together. The front of the smoke box then fitted in place, inserted inside the front of the boiler halves. Again, I used a clamp to hold things together until the gluing set. The boiler could then be attached to the top of the running board with a rectangular lug at the front and a pin further back locating it. I needed to sand the lug and the pin a bit to get them into place, but then it fitted okay. Here's the diagram for the footplate and boiler assembly. I didn't get part 11 representing the regulator, so I had to improvise for that. Here's what I had left at this point in the way of small parts, mostly buffers and couplings, at top of the handbrake and a section of piping to go on one side of the boiler. Here's how my model was at this point. I painted the handbrake, as it wouldn't really be practical to paint it after the cab was assembled. I also spray painted the inside surfaces of the cab walls and roof. I painted the floor of the cab brown. I glued on the front buffer beam, lamp irons on top, lined up with the front of the running board. The front of the cab was glued to the back of the boiler. Here you can see my rather approximate improvised regulator. I glued the left side of the cab in place, trying to get everything lined up as best as I could. I glued the handbrake in place before fixing the rest of the cab. Next, I glued the right side of the cab in place. I had more trouble getting this side to line up properly. I touched up a couple of details on the front of the cab with gold and silver markers to give a bit of detail life. Then I fixed the back of the cab in place. This included the back buffer beam. I don't quite know where they kept coal for this Loco, presumably in some kind of bin inside the cab. This was my model at this point, starting to look somewhat complete after I glued on the roof of the cab. Here's the model seen from the back at this point. I realized that I'd forgotten to attach this piece of piping. I did my best to figure out how it was supposed to go and glued it in place. I think this looks about right. I inserted small pieces of foam into the sides of the cab as I was going to spray paint all of the outside black now, and I didn't want the spray to go into the cab. Here's the model back from being sprayed black. I used Krylon rattle can paint, which is specifically intended for painting plastic. I used tweezers to pull the masking foam out of the sides of the cab. I eased the crossheads away from their rails so that I could move the rods and rotate the wheels. Then I used a silver marker on the flanges of the wheels, the rods, the crossheads, etc. Not perfect, but I think I can live with it. I actually did a bit more after this, getting the tops of the rods better. Here's a picture without flash, which is more indicative of how the model will actually normally appear. The next thing that was supposed to be done was to attach the buffers and couplings, and before doing that I wanted to paint the buffer beams, but I ran into a bit of an issue here. I looked at some pictures of these locomotives to see how they appeared, especially with regard to the buffer beams. What struck me was that in none of the pictures did the locos have metal buffers like those that came in the kit. In every picture that I found, locos of this type were fitted with simple wooden block buffers. Just rectangular wooden blocks on the ends of the buffer beams, front and back. This was true of pictures from BR days and older pictures. You can see the wooden blocks very clearly here. And here's a Class 21 loco in preservation on the East Lancashire Railway, and again we see simple wooden block buffers. So I decided that my model was going to have wooden block buffers, not the metal buffers supplied with the kit. I started by measuring the buffer beam. I also examined the pictures of the real locos carefully to try to gauge the proportions of the buffer blocks. I cut strips of 2mm styrene sheet to the height of the buffer beams and glued 2 strips together to give approximately the right thickness for the buffer blocks. Then I used an emery board to try to smooth down these double strips. Next I cut 4 blocks from the double strips and sanded those down to try to make them into even blocks. I cut off the fittings for the metal buffers on the buffer beam at the back. Then I did my best with knife, file and emery board to smooth down the ends of the beam so that I could attach my blocks. I did the same to the front buffer beam. Next, I painted the center sections of the buffer beams red. And here at the back. The kit offered the choice of cosmetic 3-link couplings or working couplings of a rather strange type. I had no intention of actually coupling this model to anything since I was building it to serve specifically as a crane load, so I went with the cosmetic couplings, colouring them before attaching them. Here is one of the 3-link couplings in place on the front buffer beam. And here's the other one on the back buffer beam. They were a bit crudely moulded, but I didn't think that they looked too bad in place. I stuck my blocks onto a piece of tape and spray painted them black. I peeled the painted blocks from the tape after the paint dried. So now I had 4 blocks painted black, but with their backs unpainted so that they could be glued. I glued 2 blocks in place on the ends of the front buffer beam, and the other 2 on the ends of the back buffer beam. At this point I tried the model on a piece of track just to see how it fitted. The fit wasn't great, but then I wasn't planning on actually running this model. Finally, I wanted to put markings on the model, and I wanted it as an LMS engine, not BR. I got out some HMRS press-fix decals for LMS locos. This set would provide the LMS letters and also numbers in various sizes. But honestly, I didn't feel up to making up the 5-digit running number required from the tiny press-fix digits. Placing those is really tricky, since the smallest breath of air movement can send them flying as they're so tiny, so I cheated using part of the decals that came with the kit. I cut off the 5s at the start of the numbers, as the locos of this class were renumbered by BR by replacing the initial 1s of their LMS running numbers with 5s. Then I applied these cut-down waterslide decals to the sides of the cab, on both sides, trying to position them so that I could add another digit in front. I stuck 1s from the press-fix set in front of the running numbers. They didn't really match properly, but I just couldn't face trying to make up the whole numbers from the press-fix digits. I put LMS letters from the press-fix set on the boiler, starting with an M in the middle. Here's my model after decaling. Clearly the running numbers don't match properly, but I'm hoping that won't be too obvious in normal use, even if it stands out rather in a flash picture like this. I used some black paint to touch up the inside of the chimney as the grey plastic was showing there. After the decals dried, I sprayed the model with clear matte acrylic fixative, mainly to protect the decals. So that was my assembly of the model, basically finished. A bit approximate, but not too bad. As I said, my whole purpose in building this kit was to use it as a crane load, so now I looked at how I might hook it up for lifting. I got out some fine chain that I'd bought, and also brought down the spreader from the Bachmann Ransoms and Rapier crane. I made a loop of chain, cutting it to length and then tying the ends together with invisible thread. By passing the ends of this loop of chain under the front and back of the Loco, I was able to create loops on either side of the Loco that could be attached to the ends of the spreader from the crane. I hung the model up by the spreader while I got the crane itself in place. Here's the Bachmann Ransoms and Rapier crane with its stabilizing beams extended and propped on the blocks that I made, hooked up and ready to lift the pug. And here the pug has been lifted off the rails. As soon as the pug is lifted clear of the ground, it swings because the spreader naturally wants to align with its attachment to the crane hook. In real lifting operation, ropes would be attached to the corners of the load, and men would hold the ends of those ropes through the operation in order to prevent the load from swaying and to control its orientation. I'm not going to include video of me operating the crane this time. It doesn't really work very well as my hands get in the way of the camera, and it's extremely fiddly to try and work the crane without moving it. So I'm going to stick with still pictures this time. Here the pug has been swung over to the other track. You can see the tool inserted into the back of the crane. This tool is inserted into holes in the back to operate the lifting and lowering of the jib and hook. When the crane is not actually being operated, the operating holes can be closed with magnetic covers. Here the pug has been swung over to the other track and is ready to be lowered. Again, of course, it doesn't line up, since the spreader will always align itself with the crane jib, so the pug would need to be pulled into alignment to allow it to be lowered onto the tracks. With respect to the weight issue, the crane had no difficulty in lifting and moving the pug model without tipping over, so building the kit to provide a crane load was basically a success. Here the hook has been lowered to deposit the pug onto the other track, as it was manually pushed into alignment. Once the hook is lowered a bit more, the load could be unhooked from the crane. Really, of course, the load would be unhooked by detaching the lifting chains at the bottom, leaving the chains attached to the crane, but my chains actually pass right under the Loco, since this was the easiest way for me to set them up. Anyway, that's it for now. On the whole, a more or less successful exercise, although I realised that I could have done a better job of finishing the pug model. And the kit itself had some annoying shortcomings, so I could only recommend it with considerable reservation.